My guest today is Professor Holden Thorp, who's editor-in-chief of the Science family of journals. Before, he was provost at Washington University, where he holds appointments in both chemistry and medicine. Welcome, Holden.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I have a number of your essays, blog posts, things like that. And we have an eclectic group of topics that we can talk about. And some of them maybe get into a little bit of a policy, politics type issues. But then these are things that are important for us to debate and discuss. I think in one of the pieces you say that journalists and podcast hosts and talk show hosts have opinions, and opinions are good, but opinions are not facts, right? So opinions need to be validated, and it is not exclusive. I would say this is my opinion, and we can debate this. It's not an exclusive territory of scientists. General public can go to scientific journals, peer-reviewed articles, and to the extent that their education allows it, they can form informed decisions or conclusions as well. So it is a process that anybody can go through, but it does require validation, replication, review before an opinion becomes a fact. So I want to start with the first piece that you sent me. It ain't over till it's over, it is entitled. And you see the Biden administration is sheepishly waving a checkered flag on the pandemic. And I think you've been a little critical of the Biden administration here, backing off a little bit on the scientific and regulatory constraints that were placed on behavior and other things during the pandemic. And I was just going to Wikipedia and looking up pandemic, and it says here, a pandemic is an epidemic of an infectious disease that has spread across a large region, for instance, multiple continents or worldwide, affecting a substantial number of individuals. So COVID-19 definitely fits there. A widespread endemic disease with a stable number of infected individuals is not a pandemic. And so the question I have, Holden, is COVID-19 a pandemic, or is it an endemic disease now?
Well, I think it's awfully early to make that decision. I mean, I'm not an epidemiologist or a virologist, but I think just the events in China of the last couple of weeks, where now we're going to have probably millions of people in China infected because they have a relatively weak vaccine and they're departing from their zero COVID. We don't know the extent to which that is going to spread across the world. It probably will. And so, I think that's one aspect of what I was saying there. But the other aspect is that, as you said, scientific facts are established by a rigorous process. That process is send in a paper, have it reviewed, post the paper and all the underlying data where everyone can see it, and then wait and see how that's received and see whether it's established as something that forms a consensus. It's not those ideas are not established by giving press conferences or pronouncing things on podcasts or writing op-eds or anything else. And so, the general conflict that I talk about a lot really is the conflict between these two things. And I think in this case, even though the people involved are very, very knowledgeable, Ashish Jha, Rochelle Walensky, these are folks who really know what they're doing. But it's not a winner politically to continue to spout doom and gloom about the pandemic, that's for sure. And so I get why they're taking the approach that they're taking. And I voted for them, and I I trust them to make those decisions, but I think that the communication would be a lot better if they said something, more consistent with the scientific consensus, which is we still got a long way to go with COVID, but given all the various constraints we're under, we're making the decision to start backing off. But they haven't done that. They've suggested that they're doing this on the basis of rigorous scientific information, and I'm not aware of what that is.
So I hear two things there, Holden. One is you believe COVID-19 is still sort of a pandemic, and it's mutating, it's creating new variants that we are not even aware of, large populations in Asia where there isn't enough tracking of variations. We don't really have information. So do I understand you correctly that you still believe you're going to have cycles of variations come through as pandemic?
Well, again, I'm not an expert on this at all. The only thing I'm an expert in is watching scientists talk to each other and understanding where that leads. But if I look at outstanding experts who really understand what's going on with this, that are people I've relied on from the beginning, I'd say they're still pretty cautious. And so what I disagree with the administration about is them breaking with those same experts who 2 years ago, when they were winning the election, they were clinging to because it was a winner politically to be cautious about COVID. So I'm just asking them to be completely truthful and about the fact that their motivations are a mix of science and politics and not just science.
Yeah, that's a bit disappointing. If policy is all about politics, then we cannot get anywhere. But as you say here, policy has to be about data, science, information, validation, verification. And in that context, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? I mean, neither of us, as you say, you're not an expert, you're a lot better expert than I am. Neither of us have enough information to conclusively say anything on the disease. We see social stress, and China is a good example of this. They tried different things, zero COVID, they backed off zero COVID now. The social stress is in some ways forcing policy. Then the question is, what's the optimum policy? If you remove in politics, you just want to win. You don't want to make optimum policy. But suppose we have a world where optimum policy always wins. How would you make it in this uncertain regime of information that we have?
Yeah, I'm not arguing that those things that you're describing are real and those are real things that have to be balanced. I'm arguing with the idea of saying that you're just relying on science when you're really relying on policy, on politics and sociology and a lot of other things. That's the part that I find objectionable, because the general public that doesn't read scientific papers. They read news stories about scientific papers and they listen to people talk about what they read in scientific papers. And if that communication is obfuscating what's really in the papers, then that's contributing to a lack of trust in science and an illiteracy about a lot of the things that we talk about. So I believe that as much work as it is, and it's easy for me to say I'm just an opinion columnist, I'm not the person who has to do it, but I believe that our communicators have to do all the work that's required to make sure that they're not saying anything that is rigorously supported by the peer-reviewed scientific literature when they're saying that we're relying on science. Now, they could say we're guessing. They could say this is the best we think we can do with the uncertain information that we have. But when they make definitive statements, then then when they have to change them, as we've seen numerous times in the pandemic, then that really erodes trust, and that's not good. Science is a living, breathing process of self-correction. And as long as we tell the public that what it is just a textbook with a bunch of stuff in it, then we're always going to be chasing this problem.
Yeah, so I was wondering, Holden, isn't there an underlying problem here? I spent half my life in India where I grew up and half my life here. And both of these countries are highly information segmented, I would say, high education variation. And so the public, as we talk about, is not at all uniform. And as you say, they don't go read scientific journals, but some of them do, but a very small percentage of them, I would say, right? So so I'm thinking, you take a Scandinavian country like Sweden or New Zealand or something, small population, 7-8 million people, highly educated. How we communicate there could be quite different from these large countries. In fact, I can't really see a solution to this problem in these large countries. Yeah.
Well, like I said, it's easy for me to say what I think the solution is. But I think the most important thing is for the scientists to realize where we stand and how much work this is to do. I get a lot of people who come to me and say, oh, can't you just get more information out there for the public to deal with all this misinformation? Well, there's about 1 million people a day on a good day for us on our website. That's a lot of people. But there's 100 million people listening to Joe Rogan. So Joe Rogan has a 2 order of magnitude advantage over us. All right. So the scientists really need to understand the fact that people don't, sure, there are people who can have the interest and ability to read the scientific literature and understand precisely what we're saying, but most people get their scientific information from intermediaries. And that's the first thing that the scientific world has to accept, which a lot of the time it doesn't. And this led to something that science communicators call the deficit model. All right, the deficit model suggests that the reason that people don't understand science is that we haven't done a good enough job explaining it. Right? So they don't they look at the Scopes trial, for example, and think that it was a trial about whether the facts of evolution were communicated so compellingly that everybody would go, oh, sure, I get it, that we all came from a common ancestor. But in fact, the Scopes trial is about religion and it's about politics. It's about the religious part is the literal interpretation of the Bible, and the political part is the nature of public education and whether the state should have the ability to say what's in public education in the United States. That's what the Scopes trial is about. It's not about gene lineages and phyla and Darwin's the beaks of the finches and all that kind of stuff. That's the stuff we like, right? And there's still a huge part of the scientific community. And if I had one message for your listeners, this would be it. Science illiteracy doesn't occur because we're bad at explaining things. I mean, you can go on Khan Academy and watch a video that lucidly explains anything you want. All right. So why aren't people looking at those videos? Well, because they've been told by ideological and religious influences that we can't be trusted. So science illiteracy is a religious and political problem. It's not a scientific problem. And until we can frame that correctly, we're going to continue to have this problem because we already have plenty of lucidly explained sources out there that people can look at if they really want to understand how immunology works, for example.
That could be true, Holden. Let me push back on that a little
Okay,
bit.
go ahead.
It's loosened to scientists and maybe quasi-scientists, right? I mean, if you're really interested in finding the truth, you can go do experimentation, research, look at the data, and so on. But not many people have the time or the inclination to do it. And so even though scientists might be out there clearly explaining everything, let's say, most people just don't have the time or the inclination to listen to it. So I think your point is same, which is it is not a communication problem. It is a political religious problem that if we are reaching there, then is there a solution to that?
Well, there's one other element to this, and that's something that sociologists call the academic fallacy, which says that we think people care about the same things that we care about, which is the point that you're making. So there are plenty of people out there who are going about their lives, taking care of their kids. They don't have a TV. They're not political junkies. They're just folks trying to make their way in the world. And they don't have time to watch one cable network say one thing about science and the other cable network say the opposite, and then say, oh, I need to go figure out which one of these things is correct. They don't have the time or the resources in terms of the having the opportunity to go look all that up, and that is certainly a major player in all this. But the people who are disputing science because of their ideological views, they're not going to be swayed by a more lucid explanation of the thing that is in dispute. That's my point.
Have you looked into any sort of comparisons between more uniformly educated countries? You know, I mentioned Sweden, New Zealand, there could be South Korea, there could be other places compared to us. Is it, supposed to be, sort of the raw materials, the foundation changes, or is that a requirement to make this communications work?
Oh, sure. Well, do you hear about people in large countries in Asia being told that the Earth is 6,000 years old? No, but in the United States, I think it's a little older than
6,000?
Yes. I think in the United States, though, you can homeschool your kid, or you can send them to a school where they're going to be taught that the Earth is 6,000 years old. And in most countries, that's illegal. So that's why I say the Scopes trial was about the role of the state in education. It wasn't about the fine details of evolution.
Yeah, so it's a fundamental problem, and the solutions are not very clear. Education becomes sort of a necessary ingredient for a society to advance. It's not education. It's not education of some. It's the education of the masses that become a requirement for society to advance. But we are sort of stuck in some sort of a I don't know what to call it, but some sort of discontinuity, I think.
Well, yeah, but it's the seeds of it have been in the United States for a long time, because a lot of people believe that this goes back to their notions of freedom, and that they should have the freedom to have their children learn things that are what they choose, and not something that the state has decided is the right thing. And it's a hard argument to win in the United States with somebody who says, but look, here are these founding documents that say I get to do this. And that's really the challenge that we haven't gotten over as a country, but it's worrisome in terms of American competitiveness, because we're competing with countries that don't have that problem.
Yes, I want to go into another essay that you have, which is somewhat related. Remember, do no harm. you say here when an advocacy group, America's Frontline Doctors, appeared on the steps of the United States Supreme Court in 2020, falsely stating that hydroxychloroquine was the cure for COVID-19, their pronouncement was widely shared by the right-wing media and soundly debunked by the medical academicians. So science is not uniform. You have false in science now. Some of the scientists and doctors are from well-known universities. They have been practicing, some of them, I believe, whatever they've been doing. But science is not uniform either. So this actually creates an additional complication vector for the general public. You say, I have seen some scientists say exactly the opposite, and they're equally qualified. So how do you
Yeah, well, this is one of the most challenging problems that we have, because, we can blame the podcast hosts, not you, of course, the hosts of other more opinionated podcasts, argumentative ones.
The really big ones.
The really big ones.
Yes.
For intentionally spreading incorrect information. But when they're doing it on the basis of words that have been stated by highly qualified academicians, then that's very hard to attack. And I posted, and you could put the link up on this as well, a long interview that I did with Tony Fauci where we discussed this point. But the whole time that we've had these kinds of controversies in the United States, again, going back roughly 100 years, we've always had this problem of having a small section of the scientific world saying something that is contrary to what the scientific consensus is, and political and journalistic interests using that to create confusion or outright misinformation. We had it in, the easiest place to start with this is in tobacco. There were mostly physicists who decided they were experts on tobacco and its physiological effects, and they wrote white papers and had press conferences and did op-eds in the Wall Street Journal saying that people were panicking and exaggerating about the dangers of tobacco. Those same people use those same tactics in climate change and in ozone, acid rain. And all of that is chronicled in an outstanding book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway called The Merchants of Doubt, which every scientist should read. But there are two things about the way that played out that, science really has to own for itself. One is, did we really do enough to try to educate the world that there was a scientific consensus about these things, and that you don't challenge scientific consensus by writing op-eds in the Wall Street Journal. You challenge scientific consensus by doing experiments and submitting papers and having them reviewed and posted with all the underlying data. And the Merchants of Doubt, Fred Seitz and Fred Singer most prominently, they didn't do that. Now, ironically, they did that when they were doing physics. So when they were doing physics, they followed all of the rules of peer-reviewed science. But when they went on to be sort of professional contrarians, they didn't do that. And so the question is it on the scientific community somehow to figure out how we're going to deal with this? And of course, we've seen this in startling detail in COVID, because you have the Great Barrington Declaration group, which includes the Surgeon General of Florida, who I was talking about in that piece, saying that we didn't need to have non-pharmaceutical interventions against COVID, which was not part of the scientific consensus, and which never appeared in highly rigorous and serious peer-reviewed publications. We had a lot of the very powerful studies showing that that masks helped, not completely, but to reduce the spread of COVID. That social distancing was worthwhile, and we never got any papers challenging that we had reviewed successfully. And I can't share the details, but we actually tried on a few to get some reviewed. So I'm very confident that a lot of these papers undermining non-pharmaceutical interventions for COVID would not have stood up to peer review. I'm sure of that.
Yeah, so I want to ask you this little bit on a tangent, Holden. So
sure.
It seems like we have a country that is divided into at least two, perhaps more. And I don't want to mention any names here, but University of Florida and the state of Florida, there's a guy there who is waiting to become president to make America great again. That the last guy couldn't quite get there, but almost did. So these scientists who have all these ideas and opinions that are not scientifically verified are always going to have a home, right? I mean, we have two different countries. Some head south and others head north. So, I mean, is this a solvable problem?
Well, it's sort of like the other thing we were talking about. The first thing is to become aware of it. And sometimes I think mainstream science tends to be naive, that if we just do all our work and put the papers in the journals, then the rest will take care of itself. And that isn't true. We've proven that isn't enough for 100 years, but we haven't really done that much about it. I mean, it's still true that, for example, in academia, if you're a science communicator or a science policy person or a great teacher, you don't have the same cred as someone who's a great researcher. And the short-sightedness of that is hitting us in the face right now, because when it comes to COVID, we did absolutely great at all the reductionist science. We got Paxlovid, we got the mRNA vaccines, we described every protein in the virus, but we couldn't get people to do all the things that were obvious from that research. So we failed at science. We succeeded at science, but we failed at social science and at communication. And partly that's our own fault, because we haven't valued those folks to the same extent we have valued great researchers. And so that's step one, really, in this process. Now, once we achieve that level of recognition, what are we going to do about it? Well, it's going to be hard. But in my opinion, the only thing we can do is what you and I are doing right now, except for way more people. And that is to help them understand that science is an iterative process done by fallible human beings, but it corrects itself because it's actually fun and rewarding to prove that something that people believed for a long time needs to be revised. That's what makes science exciting. And we have not conveyed that to the public. And so they think when we say the best we know right now is the following, and then 2 months later, we did an experiment that shows that we need to adjust that we're incompetent. But in fact, we're highly competent at science because that's what science is, and we haven't told anyone that.
Yeah, so we have a similar problem in economics, Holden. So
Yeah,
my focus has been sort of uncertainty and related valuation questions. In finance and economics, if you talk about uncertainty, they say this guy doesn't really know much because there is no uncertainty. It's all in the Excel spreadsheet. You put all the numbers in there, and out comes an answer, which is a deterministic, precise answer. And so when scientists go in front of the public and they say, hey, this is what we know today, it could change in the future, there's a lot of uncertainty. But public hears that, yeah, these guys don't know what they're talking about.
right.
They just don't know, yeah. Right.
Yeah, and we've got to figure out a way to get that across, because not knowing is what makes science exciting. Right?
So
Nobody wants to go do experiments that prove stuff that we already know.
Yes. I want to go into a completely different topic.
Sure.
Hard, not easy. You say in this essay, science's breakthrough of the year is a successful launch and deployment of the James Webb Space Telescope, JWST. A lot of people have been fascinated by this technology accomplishment, and data is already flowing in that that substantially improves the data that we already have. But let me ask you a counter view of this. I don't quite believe this, but I just want to create a debate on this.
Sure.
So I wrote a piece recently that entitled "Is Theory More Valuable Than Practice?" And I argue that we have left theory. I mean, 100 years ago, somebody in Princeton with paper and pencil showed us how the universe works by sheer intuition and mathematics. But now we have a world clamoring with engineers, sending stuff all over the place, collecting data. Artificial intelligence is a big deal. We have become sort of a data brokers. And that is a downside, doesn't it? I mean, don't we lose the ability to think in a data world?
Well, I mean, I hear in a way where you're coming from, and I do think understanding is better than seeing. But seeing comes first. And so, we've got a lot of great ways to see things. We've got artificial intelligence that can draw pictures of things that, we only imagine based on much less data. We have powerful microscopes. We have powerful telescopes. We have all of this stuff to help us see things. And certainly the process of science is not just the seeing. It's not just making the measurement. It's understanding what it means. So I guess I would say that all of these tools just make it possible for us to find even more things to understand. And if you look at the JWST, we did a lot of important and challenging engineering in order to study some things that we've always wanted to understand, which, probably the two most obvious are seeing back further in time by being able to look at greater distances. And in the last week or so, we've seen that JWST now has collected data that see so far that we're looking at only 350 million years into the history of the universe. Well, there's a lot of stuff to understand at that time and distance point. And also give us the ability to see the atmosphere of planets. We've already seen one now with sulfur dioxide that we couldn't see without JWST. So if you're a chemist that thinks about planetary science, seeing sulfur dioxide is pretty cool. It's not like seeing water or dioxygen, but still, SO2 is not something that you always see. So we're already starting to see some things that we're going to need to understand, and I think that'll lead to more theory.
Yeah, and I was thinking, Holden, I'm just saying this for sort of a debate, which is, so 250,000 years ago in African savanna, somebody stood on top of the mountain and said, there might be land in the north and the east of here. That guy was one. And then a bunch of guys went out, did the surveys, killed the leopards, and then moved away from Africa. But the first guy who said there could be land out there, by sheer imagination, adds tremendous value to science, right? So, Einstein did not have a lot of instruments. He actually didn't see much. He saw things in his imagination, right? So my fear is that the systematic education that we go through today, that creates a lot of engineers and doctors and scientists, experimenters, reduces that skill of imagination. Do you agree with that?
I certainly think that we are, but I think this is an addressable problem, because I think that and first of all, I'm not a huge expert on that part of anthropology, so I don't have any thing to necessarily say about that part. But as far as whether we're teaching future scientists to be creative, I do agree that we're hurting that. But I think the reason that we're doing that, or the way that we're doing that, is that we're filling up these curricula with far too many redundant classes. And I get in very vigorous debates with the engineers about this, because they love their ABET requirements that require all these courses on mass transport and thermodynamics and all of this stuff. But if you look at the requirements for an ABET degree, it's very specific when it comes to the engineering things. And then the other parts, like the humanities and social sciences, that would cause you to wonder, what's possible for the world based on what the world has achieved in the past, for example. That's very vague. I mean, it has little lip service in there about, oh, we should make sure this is included, but it doesn't really tell you how many differential equations classes you are get rid of in order to make room for that. And so that does a bunch of bad things, because for one thing, it creates a burden, a didactic burden that makes being a scientist or an engineer less attractive. And it also crowds out, teaching people how to think. I mean, we live in a world, as you and I were talking about earlier, where if you want to teach yourself some didactic material, there's a large number of resources available for doing that. It's not clear you need to be sitting in a lecture hall listening to somebody talk and write equations on the board in order to do that anymore. And so what we really need is a more holistic education that gives young budding scientists the ability to balance these things and kind of sift through all of these data to find the underlying questions.
Yeah, I agree. So I want to go into another topic, a couple of essays here that are related. So science needs affirmative action. As science struggles, you say here, to correct systemic racism in the laboratory and throughout academia in the United States, external forces press on, making it even more difficult to achieve equity on all fronts, including among scientists. Yeah, I know there's a case, Harvard UNC against somebody. I'm a bit conflicted about this, Holden. So it seems conceptually correct that affirmative action will sort of make the field more level for everybody. But there's a downside to it, right? I mean, is there?
Well, I don't personally see that. I think that there are a lot of barriers to, and we were just talking about this, when we have these, large numbers of didactic courses that everybody has to do, and when the colleges are deciding who gets to go do all that based on tests that have been developed over a long time, all of that stuff was developed, the curricula and the standardized testing that grants people access to it, at a time when there weren't as many different kinds of people trying to be scientists. And so that, we know that that has created barriers for people who have other cultural norms and opportunities. And many of those reduced opportunities are also the result of systemic racism and other kinds of discrimination. And so if we, and we can measure all that, right? Social scientists can study these barriers. So here we have something that we can establish using our tried and true methods of making measurements and subjecting them to peer analysis, that we know are creating dislocations in opportunity. And so we're honor bound to follow that. I mean, I think that the counter argument that some people make is that then you're lowering the somehow lowering the standards. But we just both agreed that we're already bombarding students with too much didactic material to begin with. So if that's true, then what standards are we lowering by making science more accessible? I mean, I don't personally see that. And I think the imperative to live up to our ideals and to live up to things that we have established as existing and needing correction overwhelms all of that by a mile.
Yeah, so my problem is in the selection process, Holden. And you know a lot about how UNC does things. I know nothing about this. So suppose in the selection process, I have an attribute called color, and there are four colors there: brown, yellow, black, and white. And I do some sort of a scoring, algorithm, maybe even a simple regression. And I say I have an output, a required output that equalizes these four colors into the next class. Then we have this in the data. Perhaps just for argument's sake, the yellow and brown have high SAT scores but low social skills, and the white has high social skills but low SAT scores. I'm just making this up. If I have a constraint optimization on the selection process, it is not meritocracy anymore. It is actually mathematics with biases leading to admission decisions. Would you agree with that?
No, because I think that the notion of meritocracy is based on outdated criteria. And I think these things are holistic, and it's short-sighted to say that this one measure, which was established by people who weren't included and is based on the attributes of one group, is automatically applicable to everyone. That's I don't think that's culturally sound. So I think, but I mean, we've identified the main problem here, and that is, whether there's a way to define merit in a way that everybody could accept that would work. And I'm of the ideology, which I'm showing here, that that's an outdated idea, and that it's an idea that has deprived a lot of people the opportunity to participate in science.
And you mentioned this before. Now that I say here, inclusion doesn't lower standards. You say the cultural wars raging across the United States have sadly found their way into the world of science. Some university science faculty and administrators are resistant to making changes that would allow more students from underrepresented groups to participate and thrive in the sciences. And if I remember correctly, Holden, you're saying here that the administrators and the faculty are changing, they are saying they don't have the skills to be competing here, right? Something along those lines.
Well, the main point I'm making there is that there are things that we can do that we know, again, from rigorous research, that would make it possible for more people to succeed in our courses. Now, I'm somebody who succeeded the old way. I was fine watching somebody drone on and write equations on the blackboard and taking high stakes tests. Okay, I wouldn't be here if I wasn't good at that. But there's lots of research that shows that just selecting people who can do that is excluding a lot of people from science, when there are things we could do to make our lectures, for example, more culturally aware, by not just having material in a format where you can absorb it at your own correct pace that's right for you, and by doing assessments that don't involve putting everybody in a room and making everybody be quiet and write down answers in a very large group, which a lot of people find intimidating just because of the signals that they've received over the course of their lives. And in my opinion, we owe it to science and the future of science to try to correct for that. And it's doable, but it's a lot of work. And this gets to a really complicated question about the resources and priorities of the institutions. Because it's true that there are some faculty who are resistant to doing this because they think the old way makes better scientists. But there are also faculty who want to do it, but whose institutions are not sufficiently committed to this to give them the resources to change the way they teach, and to take time away, for example, from their research, which is what they're much more consistently rewarded for. And so there's an institutional will that needs to be there to deal with this that is also lacking. And that's really because universities try to do too many different things.
Mm.
They try to win football games. They try to make donors happy. They try to climb in these statistically meaningless rankings. They want the students to be happy at the gym and all of this stuff. But really, the base, most important thing should be teaching and education.
Mm.
And most universities might say in their brochures that that's their top priority, but if you look at their actions, it's very hard to conclude that they've really made a decision to prioritize that. And that is really affecting this particular debate, because if you're a young faculty member trying to figure out whether to be a good teacher or a good researcher, and if you want to be a better teacher, where you get help to do that, that's very confusing.
Yeah, so I want to finish up, Holden. You have a paragraph here about the University of Chicago, a university very close to my heart. It says University of Chicago has engaged in very effective public relations campaign for the past several years to brand itself as a free speech university. And I have experience there. Experienced that. Yeah, I don't know how to say this. I mean, it's also a little bit disappointing that some university graduates now are criminals or referred to criminal procedures to the DOJ, which never happened in this university compared to their East Coast sister schools. So things are changing there, but you say contemporarily, this is a place where you can express free ideas and it seems to stand alone.
Well, I hope I wasn't saying that. What I was trying to say was that in this whole debate about free speech on college campuses, the University of Chicago is held up as this by people who think that we should have more of what they call ideological diversity at universities as this great example. And they do have these various statements that they've made. But the same people who hold that up don't like a lot of things that we have in student affairs that cater to students based on their identity. But if you look at the University of Chicago's website and you look at their student affairs website, guess what? They have just as many identity-oriented centers and services as any of their peers. So if the University of Chicago really believes that we should have, identity neutral speech, they're not living that out in terms of where they're making their investments and their actions. And so, I'm an opinion columnist who calls out dislocations in the world. And I find the University of Chicago, which is an outstanding university in every respect, and you are lucky to get to spend time there because they do an amazing job at many different things. But a lot of their rhetoric, which they've really benefited from in certain quarters, isn't entirely consistent with their actions. And so I just think that the people that are constantly, holding up University of Chicago as this great example and saying, read is really awful because they're so ideologically to the left. Well, Reed and the University of Chicago are a lot closer to each other on the ground than those same people realize.
Yeah,
so that's more of just a kind of whimsical observation more than anything else.
Yeah, it is an important observation, right? So implementing philosophy is very difficult. Creating philosophy is easier.
Yeah.
So you say I'm philosophically, on the left top corner or whatever, and I make statements around those, but sort of living up to those philosophical background is quite difficult in a university setting. You know more about this than I do.
Yeah, and I'm glad that the University of Chicago has all those identity-based services and centers. The students need all that stuff. So I guess for me, it's probably good that they're not living up to their rhetoric. But the people who, but yes, you're putting your finger on something very important, which is why I say frequently as a columnist, it's easy for me to say this. I'm not the one who has to go do it. And so in this case, the University of Chicago is saying one thing, but they're finding on the ground that it's harder to do. And I think that's a product of the fact that there are a lot of people there who care about their students and want to give them what they need.
Yeah, so do you think as we go forward, you take all the universities in the US, do you think they're all going to sort of gravitate toward a common spot? What do you see in the next 10, 15, 20 years from now?
Well, I hope not, because I think what's great about the American university system is that there are a lot of different options out there and students can find what's right for them. So I don't think they will, and I hope they don't, because students should have a choice of going to a place where they will thrive. But what I do think we need that we don't have is a more honest accounting of who fits where, because you want as much of that out there as you can possibly get so that students can make informed choices about going to a place that fits for them. And I think, unfortunately, if you compare one brochure to another, most of the words on there are identical. we want to have a supportive community where students can thrive and everyone's included, and where you can pursue your academic dreams. And if you look at those brochures, how would you know how one school is different from the other? And it would be great if universities had the courage to do that better. But it's hard, because if you say this is what we are and you're a big institution with a lot of people in it, then everybody who isn't in whatever you just said is going to be very upset. I had the opportunity to spend the last 6 years at Washington University in St. Louis, which almost everyone in the country or in the world who understands that institution would say is a life sciences oriented university. It's got a big, powerful medical school, and the best departments in the rest of the university are life sciences oriented in one way or another. But if you're a mechanical engineer or a historian, you don't want to hear that WashU is the land of biology. And so I never said that when I was the provost of Washington University, even though I tried to do things that recognize the fact that that's how everybody in the world saw us.
Yeah, it's good. It's good that you don't have a competitive football team, Holden. So that saves University of Chicago two days every week to focus on other things. I don't know about WashU, but I don't believe WashU has a competitive football team either, right?
WashU is in D3, and we're in the same conference as the University of Chicago. So we play the most. In fact, we're the biggest rivals. We play a football game called the Founders Cup every year, which is attended by 300 or 400 people.
Excellent.
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, this is.
And I can't even tell you whether we won the last one or not. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to be crying about it.
No.
Excellent, Holden. So this has been great. Thanks so much for doing this during a holiday week.
Well, listen, Gill, great talking to you. And thanks for all you're doing to spread useful information to the world.
Thank you.